There is a part of you that decides when you lower your eyes, soften your voice, explain yourself too much, or agree when your body is screaming no. And it is not weakness. It is not lack of intelligence. It is not lack of confidence. It is a decision made by a hidden structure in your psyche long before your conscious mind catches up. Carl Jung called it the shadow. Not the shadow as evil, but the shadow as disowned power. This is the part of you that learned very early that power was dangerous. That visibility had a cost. That asserting yourself led to rejection, punishment, abandonment, or emotional chaos. So it adapted. It learned how to survive by stepping back, by yielding, by becoming agreeable, by reading the room faster than anyone else. Over time, this adaptation became automatic. And eventually, it became identity. You don't say, "I'm submitting right now." You say, "It's not worth the conflict." You say, "That's just how they are." You say, "I'll deal with it later." You say, "I don't want to seem difficult." But beneath the language of reason is a shadow contract. A silent agreement your psyche makes in moments of tension. I will give up power in exchange for safety. This is where submission actually begins. Not in the body, not in the behavior, but in the unconscious belief that power must be traded to survive. And here's the uncomfortable truth. The shadow does not want peace. It wants control through avoidance. When you submit, the shadow feels temporarily safe. The nervous system relaxes. The threat passes. The conflict dissolves. And your psyche learns something dangerous. Submission works. That learning doesn't stay in one situation. It generalizes. It shows up with authority figures, with dominant personalities, with emotionally unpredictable people, with partners who withdraw affection, with bosses who speak confidently. Your body recognizes the pattern before your mind does. The tightening in your chest, the impulse to justify, the urge to explain yourself instead of stating, the reflex to comply even when it costs you. This is not conscious choice. This is conditioning. And the shadow enforces it mercilessly. Because the shadow is not moral. It doesn't care about fairness, dignity, or long-term fulfillment. It cares about avoiding perceived danger. And perceived danger doesn't have to be real. It only has to resemble the past. This is why you can feel powerless in situations where there is no actual threat. No one is yelling. No one is attacking. No one is forcing you. And yet, you fold. Because the shadow remembers something your conscious mind has forgotten. A time when power led to pain. So the shadow steps in and says, "Not again." And you submit. But here is the part most people never see. Submission is not always about fear. Sometimes it is about forbidden desire. The shadow doesn't only contain what you fear, it contains what you were not allowed to want. Dominance, control, authority, impact, the right to take up space without apology. If you grew up learning that these traits were unacceptable, selfish, dangerous, or too much, your psyche did something clever. It buried them. And when something is buried, it doesn't disappear. It turns into attraction. You find yourself magnetized to people who express what you deny. Their confidence unsettles you. Their certainty intimidates you. Their dominance feels overwhelming. And without realizing it, you place them above you. Not because they are superior, but because they are carrying your disowned authority. This is one of the deepest roots of submission. You are bowing to a part of yourself that you never integrated. And as long as that part remains unconscious, it will rule you from the outside. You will submit not because you are weak, but because your power is split. One part of you lives consciously, polite, rational, adaptive. Another part lives in the shadow, assertive, forceful, unapologetic. And whenever these two parts meet in the world, the shadow wins. Because it always does. Not through action, but through reaction. This is why willpower doesn't fix submission. This is why affirmations don't work. This is why "just be confident" feels like an insult. You are not lacking strength. You are lacking integration. The moment you begin to see submission not as a flaw, but as a signal, everything changes. Every time you feel the urge to shrink, appease, or comply, Something is being activated. A memory, a belief, a rule written long ago. And that rule can be rewritten. But not by fighting it, not by shaming it, not by pretending you're above it. The shadow doesn't respond to force. It responds to recognition. When you stop asking, "Why am I like this?" and start asking, "What is this protecting me from?" the dynamic shifts. Because the shadow submits only when it feels seen. And once it no longer needs to protect you from imagined danger, it no longer needs to control you. This is where real power begins. Not loud power, not aggressive power, but grounded power. The kind that doesn't rush, doesn't explain, doesn't justify. The kind that knows when to speak and when silence is stronger. The kind that no longer submits automatically, because it is no longer afraid of itself. Submission becomes truly invisible when it disguises itself as virtue. You tell yourself you are being mature, understanding, evolved. You convince yourself that yielding is wisdom, that restraint is strength, that silence is peace. And sometimes it is. But when silence consistently costs you dignity, when restraint repeatedly benefits others at your expense, when peace only exists because you erased yourself, something else is operating beneath the surface. That something is not goodness. It is fear fused with loyalty to an old identity. The shadow does not submit randomly. It submits strategically. It scans the environment for cues that resemble past danger and then activates a learned response. This response once protected you. It kept you connected to caregivers, groups, or systems you depended on. But the psyche does not automatically update its software. It keeps running the same code long after the context has changed. So you find yourself yielding to people who have no real power over you. You soften in conversations where firmness would be appropriate. You accept conditions you internally reject. And afterward, you feel drained, resentful, or strangely numb. That numbness is important. Numbness is not calm. It is shut down power. When the shadow decides submission is safer than expression, it pulls energy away from the surface of consciousness. You disconnect slightly. You go into autopilot. This is why submission often feels unreal, like you weren't fully present when it happened. Because you weren't. Presence and submission cannot coexist for long. This is also why people who habitually submit often feel exhausted without understanding why. They are constantly negotiating with an internal split. One part wants to assert. Another part overrides it in the name of safety. That override costs energy every single time. And the cost accumulates. Over time, this unresolved tension creates a quiet bitterness. Not always visible. Often well managed. But it leaks. In tone. In timing. In passive resistance. In emotional distance. In self-sabotage just when things could improve. The shadow keeps score. Every time you don't speak, it remembers. Every time you betray your own boundary, it notes it. Every time you choose safety over truth, it tightens its grip. This is why submission eventually turns into anger, not outward anger, but inward corrosion. You begin to doubt yourself. You second-guess your perceptions. You lose trust in your own impulses. And when you no longer trust yourself, you become easier to lead, easier to shape, easier to control. This is not accidental. Systems, social, relational, professional, reward predictable people. People who won't disrupt the flow. People who absorb tension instead of redistributing it. People who carry emotional weight so others don't have to. The shadow understands this economy very well. It learned that compliance keeps you included. That being easy keeps you safe. That resistance risks exile. And exile, to the nervous system, feels fatal. So the shadow intervenes before you even realize what's happening. You laugh something off. You change the subject. You delay a decision. You say yes when you mean no. And you call it choice. But choice without awareness is compulsion. The moment you begin watching these moments closely, a pattern emerges. Submission doesn't happen everywhere. It happens in specific contexts, with specific people, around specific themes. Authority, intimacy, money, visibility, conflict. These are not random triggers. They are symbolic. Authority activates early experiences of power imbalance. Intimacy activates fear of abandonment. Money activates worth and survival. Visibility activates shame and exposure. Conflict activates loss of connection. Your shadow learned its rules here. And those rules were written when you had fewer options than you do now. This is why submission often feels outdated, like a reaction that doesn't match the present moment. Because it doesn't. It belongs to a younger version of you who had to adapt quickly to survive. That younger part is still inside. Still vigilant. Still convinced that asserting yourself will cost you everything. It is not stupid. It is loyal. But loyalty to an old threat becomes self-betrayal in a new reality. The work is not to destroy this part. It is to update it. And updating does not happen through logic alone. It happens through experience. Through small, deliberate acts of non-submission. Not dramatic confrontations. Not sudden personality shifts. But moments where you allow tension to exist without immediately resolving it. You pause instead of explaining. You state instead of justifying. You say no without adding a story. You hold eye contact instead of looking away. These moments feel uncomfortable at first because they violate an internal contract. The shadow reacts. Anxiety rises. The urge to fix, smooth, or apologize appears. This is the edge. If you retreat here, the old rule is reinforced. If you stay, even briefly, something new is learned. Nothing catastrophic happens. The world does not collapse. Connection is not automatically lost. You remain intact. This is how the shadow begins to trust consciousness. Not through reassurance, but through evidence. Each time you assert without punishment, the shadow loosens its grip. Each time you survive being misunderstood, it updates its risk assessment. Each time you choose truth over safety and remain whole, integration deepens. Submission loses its urgency. You don't become confrontational. You become grounded. And grounding is the opposite of submission. Grounding means you are anchored in yourself. You feel your weight. You occupy your space internally before trying to manage it externally. From this place, submission becomes a choice rather than a reflex. Sometimes you will still yield. But it will be intentional, strategic, temporary. And because it is chosen, it will not drain you. This is the difference between conscious flexibility and unconscious submission. One preserves power. The other leaks it. When the shadow is integrated, you stop giving away power preemptively. You wait. You observe. You respond proportionally. You no longer rush to make yourself smaller to make others comfortable. Comfort stops being your responsibility. And when comfort is no longer your job, authority reorganizes naturally. People sense it. They adjust. Some step up. Some step away. You let them. Because you are no longer negotiating your right to exist with weight. The dark part of you that once decided when you submit does not disappear. It changes roles. It becomes discernment. It becomes restraint. It becomes the ability to say no without hostility and yes without fear. It stops pulling you down and starts holding you steady. And from that steadiness, submission is no longer your default. Presence is. From presence, something subtle but irreversible happens. You begin to feel the moment before submission. Not after. Not during. Before. There is a microsecond where your body already knows what you're about to do. Your breath changes. Your shoulders soften. Your voice prepares to lower. Your mind starts searching for a reason to comply. That moment used to pass unnoticed. Now it doesn't. Awareness interrupts the reflex. This is where real power starts, not in domination, not in control over others, but in interrupting automatic self-erasure. Most people think submission is a behavior. It's not. It's a state of nervous system organization. When your system anticipates threat, emotional, social, or symbolic, it chooses the fastest path to reduce risk. For some, that's aggression. For others, it's withdrawal. For many, it's submission disguised as kindness. The shadow prefers whatever has worked before. So if compliance once kept you loved, included, or unharmed, your system will keep offering it, even when it's no longer necessary. This is why you can be objectively successful and still feel internally small. Why you can be competent yet hesitate to claim space. Why you can be intelligent yet defer to people who haven't earned authority. Your outer life may have changed. Your inner hierarchy hasn't. Inside, the shadow still believes certain figures outrank you. Not because they do, but because they resemble someone who once did. And resemblance is enough. The psyche doesn't differentiate between past and present the way the mind does. It reacts to pattern, tone, posture, energy. A raised eyebrow, a delayed reply, a cold silence. These are interpreted as danger signals by a shadow that learned early that displeasing the wrong person has consequences. So you comply before conflict even forms. This is why submission often feels involuntary. Because it is, until it's seen. Once seen, it becomes a negotiation instead of a command. And negotiations change dynamics. Here's what almost no one tells you. When you stop submitting unconsciously, you will feel temporarily more anxious, not less. Because anxiety is the cost of updating your internal order. The shadow will test you. It will say, "You're being difficult. You're risking rejection. You're about to lose something. You should smooth this over." This is not intuition. This is conditioning defending itself. If you mistake this voice for wisdom, you retreat. If you recognize it as an outdated survival strategy, you stay. Staying doesn't mean escalating. It means not collapsing. You let silence exist. You allow tension to hang. You resist the urge to over-explain. This restraint feels almost violent to the old self, not because it is, but because it breaks a sacred rule: keep others comfortable at your expense. That rule once kept you safe. Now it keeps you small. And smallness is not humility. It's distortion. True humility does not require disappearance. As you stop disappearing, something interesting happens in your relationships and environments. People begin revealing how they relate to power. Some become respectful. They sense your groundedness and adjust accordingly. These relationships deepen. Some become confused. They were used to you yielding. They test boundaries. They push a little harder. Some become hostile. Because your submission was never about harmony, it was about control, and they just lost it. This sorting process is unavoidable and necessary. Submission creates false peace. Presence creates real alignment. The shadow understands this only after experience proves it. Not after reading. Not after insight. After lived evidence. Each time you hold your ground and survive, the shadow updates. Each time you assert and remain connected, it relaxes. Each time you choose self-respect over approval and nothing catastrophic happens, the old hierarchy weakens. You stop seeing others as towering figures and start seeing them as equals with preferences. And equality is destabilizing, for both sides. Because many systems rely on unspoken submission to function. When it disappears, power has to become explicit, negotiated, or shared. That's why integrated people are often labeled intense or hard to read. Not because they're aggressive, but because they don't leak submission cues. They don't rush to reassure. They don't rush to explain. They don't rush to comply. They respond. And response implies choice. Choice is threatening to any dynamic built on predictability. This is where the shadow transforms again. What once enforced submission now enforces boundaries. Not rigid walls, but clear edges. You feel where you end and others begin. You no longer take responsibility for emotions that aren't yours. You no longer absorb tension to keep systems running. You allow friction. Friction reveals truth. Without friction, everything feels smooth, but stagnant. The shadow's final role is not to dominate or submit, but to protect your center. To ensure you don't abandon yourself reflexively. To remind you, somatically, when you're about to shrink. At that stage, submission only happens when it serves something higher: learning, strategy, compassion, not fear. You can yield without resentment. You can comply without self-erasure. You can be flexible without being weak. And when you do choose to stand firm, it's quiet, grounded, undramatic. Because power no longer needs to announce itself. It's felt. And once it's felt, the question is no longer, why do I submit? It becomes, who am I when I don't? When you don't submit, something even deeper surfaces. Guilt. Not the obvious kind. Not moral guilt. Existential guilt, the feeling that by standing your ground, you're violating an unspoken contract. As if you're betraying an invisible agreement that once defined your place in the world. This guilt doesn't come from wrongdoing. It comes from disobedience to an old identity. Your shadow remembers who you were required to be. The agreeable one. The easy one. The one who absorbed tension so others didn't have to. The one who learned that love was conditional on adaptation. So when you stop adapting, the shadow panics. It whispers that you're selfish, cold, uncooperative, difficult. It frames self-respect as danger because, historically, it was. But history is not destiny. What you're feeling is the death of a role. And roles never die quietly. They resist. They dramatize. They exaggerate consequences. They replay worst-case scenarios in your nervous system as if they're inevitable. This is why holding your ground can feel disproportionately intense compared to the actual situation. You're not reacting to the present moment. You're exiting a psychological position that once ensured survival. Submission was never about weakness. It was about intelligence, the intelligence of a child reading a room and choosing the safest posture. That intelligence doesn't disappear when you grow up. It simply waits for new instructions. And until you give it new evidence, it will default to what it knows. This is why change doesn't happen through affirmation. It happens through embodiment. The moment you pause instead of agreeing. The moment you say, I need time, instead of, okay. The moment you let someone's disappointment exist without fixing it. These moments are not dramatic externally. Internally, they're seismic. Because your shadow is watching closely. It's asking one question only. Do we survive this? Every time the answer is yes, a recalibration occurs. And slowly, your system stops interpreting assertion as threat. What replaces submission isn't aggression. It's gravity. You begin to speak slower, not faster. You begin to listen without preloading your response. You stop explaining yourself preemptively. Your words carry weight because they're no longer offered as currency. This shift is subtle, but others feel it immediately. People respond to certainty of self, not force. And certainty doesn't come from confidence. It comes from internal permission. Permission to take up space. Permission to be disagreed with. Permission to be misunderstood temporarily. The shadow, once integrated, becomes the guardian of this permission. It alerts you not when others disapprove, but when you're about to abandon yourself to avoid that disapproval. That's its new job. And it does it quietly. As this integration deepens, you'll notice something unsettling. Some of your old strategies stop working. Overgiving no longer earns closeness. Over-explaining no longer earns understanding. Over-functioning no longer earns security. Because these strategies were never meant to create connection. They were meant to prevent loss. Now that you're no longer operating from fear of loss, the strategies collapse. And something more real takes their place. Reciprocity. You begin to notice who meets you halfway. Who respects pauses. Who doesn't punish boundaries. Who doesn't escalate when they don't get compliance. These people were always there, but you couldn't see them while you were busy submitting to everyone. At the same time, certain dynamics intensify briefly. Some people push harder. They sense the shift and try to restore the old order. Not consciously, instinctively. They're responding to their own shadows. This is where many people revert. Not because they can't hold power, but because they don't want to be seen as the cause of tension. But tension was never caused by your presence. It was masked by your absence. When you stop disappearing, the imbalance becomes visible. And visibility feels like conflict, until it becomes clarity. Eventually, a strange calm sets in. Not because life becomes easier, but because your internal alignment stabilizes. You no longer argue with yourself about whether you should speak, set a boundary, or say no. You feel it. You act. You move on. No rumination. No replaying conversations. No self-betrayal hangover. This is the deepest marker of integration. When your actions no longer require justification to yourself. At that point, submission becomes a conscious tool, not a reflex. You can yield strategically, temporarily, deliberately, without losing your center. And that's real power. Not dominance over others, but sovereignty over your own responses. The shadow no longer decides when you submit. You do. And when you choose not to, there is no fear attached. Only presence, stillness, and an internal order that no longer needs to collapse to keep the world intact. There is another layer beneath this that most people never reach, because it requires staying present after the first sense of empowerment fades. At first, not submitting feels like strength. Later, it feels like exposure. Once the reflex dissolves, you're left without the familiar armor of compliance. There's no automatic smile, no immediate agreement, no softening gesture to smooth the moment. And in that space, something uncomfortable emerges. You are seen without negotiation. This is where many people mistake integration for completion. They think the work is done once they stop chasing approval. But the deeper challenge begins when you realize that not submitting doesn't guarantee safety, admiration, or acceptance. It only guarantees honesty. Your shadow doesn't want power for its own sake. It wants certainty. And certainty used to come from predictability. If I do this, I will be tolerated. When that equation breaks, the shadow feels unmoored. This is why people often oscillate after initial progress. One moment they're grounded, the next they're overcorrecting, becoming rigid, detached, or performatively strong. This isn't regression. It's the psyche testing extremes to find balance. True integration lives between submission and domination. And that balance requires something more demanding than confidence: emotional endurance. The endurance to stay present when someone doesn't like your answer. The endurance to let silence stretch without filling it. The endurance to be internally calm while externally unresolved. Most people submit not because they are weak, but because they are intolerant of emotional ambiguity. They rush to restore equilibrium, even if it costs them their position. When you stop doing that, the nervous system has to learn a new skill: holding tension without collapsing. This is where your body becomes the battlefield. You may notice tightness in the chest when you don't explain yourself. A spike of heat when someone questions your decision. An urge to justify, soften, or retreat. These sensations are not signs that you're wrong. They are remnants of an older calibration. The shadow stored these responses when it learned that unresolved tension led to punishment, withdrawal, or shame. Now it's surfacing them not to sabotage you, but to see if the rule still applies. And every time you remain steady, the rule loses authority. Over time, the internal dialogue changes. Instead of "I should say something," it becomes "I'm choosing not to." Instead of "this feels wrong," it becomes "this feels unfamiliar." Instead of "I'm being selfish," it becomes "I'm being precise." Precision replaces guilt. You start responding rather than reacting. You choose when to engage, when to disengage, when to assert, and when to yield. None of it is compulsive anymore. This is the point where power becomes quiet. There's no need to signal it. No need to prove it. No need to win. People often misinterpret this calm as passivity. But it's the opposite. It's control without effort. You don't raise your voice because you're not trying to overpower resistance. You don't rush decisions because you're not afraid of pressure. You don't explain excessively because you trust your internal alignment. This unsettles those who rely on urgency, confusion, or emotional leverage. And here's the paradox. The less you try to hold power, the more naturally it organizes around you. Not because others submit to you, but because your presence no longer invites domination. Submission and domination are two sides of the same unresolved dynamic. When one disappears, the other loses its function. This is why integrated people are rarely involved in power struggles. There's nothing to hook into. Their shadow isn't suppressed. It's stationed. It steps forward when boundaries are crossed. It withdraws when engagement is unnecessary. It doesn't need to be loud to be effective. And perhaps the most unexpected shift happens internally. You stop fantasizing about being seen as strong. You no longer rehearse moments where you finally stand up for yourself. You don't need those imaginary victories anymore, because you're already inhabiting your authority in small, continuous ways. Authority becomes boring, and boring is stable. That stability changes how you relate to desire. You no longer want to be chosen at the cost of self-erasure. You want resonance, not approval. Depth, not validation. This is why some connections fall away when you integrate your shadow. They were sustained by asymmetry. Once that asymmetry dissolves, there's nothing left to negotiate. What remains are relationships built on mutual presence rather than unconscious roles. And at that point, submission becomes something entirely different. It's no longer the disappearance of self. It's the voluntary alignment with something meaningful, without fear. You can commit without shrinking. You can cooperate without erasing yourself. You can yield without losing your center. Because the dark part of you, the one that once decided when you submit, has learned a new rule. You don't submit to survive. You choose, or you don't. And either way, you remain whole. Once this shift settles, something subtle but profound begins to happen. Your relationship with pressure changes. Pressure used to feel like a threat, a signal that you were about to lose something: approval, connection, stability, belonging. And your shadow learned long ago that the fastest way to neutralize that threat was to bend, to accommodate, to disappear just enough to stay included. But now, pressure feels different. It still registers in the body, but it no longer dictates behavior. It becomes information, not a command. You notice it. You allow it. You don't obey it. This is where most people get confused about power. They think power is the absence of fear. It isn't. Power is the ability to feel fear without rearranging yourself around it. Your shadow once believed that discomfort meant danger. Now it starts to learn that discomfort can simply mean growth, friction, or misalignment. That distinction changes everything. Because once discomfort is no longer equated with danger, submission loses its urgency. You no longer rush to smooth things over. You no longer preempt rejection by self-rejecting. You no longer sacrifice clarity for harmony. Harmony that requires self-betrayal is not harmony. It's containment. And your psyche knows the difference. At this stage, another layer of the shadow reveals itself, the part that enjoyed submission because it avoided responsibility. This is uncomfortable to admit, but essential to see. Submission isn't only about fear. It's also about relief. Relief from choosing. Relief from leading. Relief from being accountable for outcomes. When you submit, someone else decides. Someone else carries the weight. Someone else takes the risk of being wrong. Your shadow didn't just want safety. It wanted rest. So when submission dissolves, responsibility rushes in. And that can feel heavy at first. You realize there's no one to hide behind anymore. No authority to blame. No dynamic to disappear into. This is why people sometimes romanticize dominance in others. They mistake abdication for peace. But real peace doesn't come from being directed. It comes from being internally aligned. As you stay with this, your sense of self becomes less reactive and more deliberate. You stop asking, "What do they want from me?" and start asking, "What is actually required here?" That question shifts your entire orientation. You begin to notice how often situations are ambiguous, not hierarchical. How many interactions don't actually require submission or dominance, only presence and clarity. And when dominance does appear, you no longer personalize it. You see it as behavior, not truth. Someone raising their voice is not power. Someone pressuring you is not authority. Someone withdrawing affection is not superiority. These are strategies. Once you see them as strategies, they lose their hypnotic effect. Your shadow, which once reacted automatically, now observes. It notices patterns. It recognizes timing. It senses when engagement is useful and when it's draining. This is where intuition sharpens, not the mystical kind, but the grounded, embodied knowing that comes from self-trust. You trust your pacing. You trust your silence. You trust your no, even when it's misunderstood. And misunderstanding no longer feels like a catastrophe. Earlier in life, being misunderstood threatened your belonging. Now it simply clarifies alignment. This creates a quiet filter around your life. People who rely on compliance, emotional leverage, or unspoken contracts drift away, not because you push them out, but because there's nothing to grip. Others respond differently. Some become curious. Some become respectful. Some become defensive. All of that is data, not drama. You stop trying to manage perceptions because you're no longer trying to survive them. And here's the deeper truth most people never hear. When your shadow stops deciding when you submit, it doesn't turn you into a dominant person. It turns you into a grounded one. Grounded people don't need to control. They don't need to impress. They don't need to win. Their strength comes from internal coherence. What they think, feel, say, and do are no longer fragmented. This coherence is what others sense as presence. Presence is what creates influence without force. And influence without force is the highest form of power. Because it's not taken. It's not imposed. It's not negotiated. It's felt. And at that point, submission becomes obsolete as a default response. Not because you're resisting it, but because it's no longer relevant. You don't submit out of fear. You don't resist out of ego. You respond out of alignment. Sometimes that means stepping forward. Sometimes that means stepping back. Sometimes that means walking away without explanation. All of it comes from the same place. Inner authority. The dark part of you that once decided when you submit has not been destroyed. It has been educated. It now understands that power is not something you give away to stay safe, nor something you take to feel important. Power is what remains when you stop abandoning yourself under pressure. And once that lesson is learned, it doesn't unlearn itself. It becomes your baseline. And this is where everything comes full circle. Because once you see this, you can't unsee it. You start noticing how often your reactions were never really about the present moment, but about old survival strategies running in the background. You realize that the version of you that used to submit wasn't weak, it was adaptive. It learned how to survive environments where power felt scarce and approval felt necessary. But you're not there anymore. And the moment you stop letting that old strategy run your life, something changes in how you move through the world. You speak with less urgency. You listen without shrinking. You act without needing permission. Not because you're trying to be dominant, but because you're no longer negotiating your worth. This is what integrating the shadow actually looks like. Not becoming darker. Not becoming colder. But becoming whole. When you don't reject the part of you that once submitted, it stops needing to control you. It stops whispering fear into your decisions. It stops pulling you into dynamics that drain your energy and diminish your presence. And from that place, your life simplifies. Relationships either deepen or dissolve. Work becomes clearer. Boundaries become natural. You stop asking how to gain power over others, and instead you gain power over your own reactions. And that kind of power is quiet, stable, and impossible to manipulate. If this resonated with you, if you felt something shift while listening, that's a sign you're ready to go deeper. Subscribe to the channel for more content on the shadow, power dynamics, and psychological awareness. Like this video so it reaches others who need to hear it. Share it with someone who's been stuck in the same patterns. And leave a comment, not to perform, but to reflect. Because awareness isn't built in isolation. And the work you just began is only the beginning.